And continuing, bringing up the rear on the rivalry recon series, save the best for last. We are headed to Detroit to check out the Lions. And with us today, we have Rachel Hopmayer of CBS Detroit to give us all the insight that we need on the division's leading team. And I think still will be. I don't know. Rachel, how are we? How are we feeling? How's your summer going?
We're great. We didn't have mini camp around these parts, so it's been a pretty extended off season, but training camp is just around the corner and we have so much to talk about what's going down in Allen Park.
I'm so excited to get to that because you're right. There wasn't the mini camp, which was kind of the hard reset. That's when summer begins, but it means that you guys are going to, or the Lions rather, are going to start and out with summer camp. And I can't believe we're saying that because I'm like, it's mid-July. What do you mean that football is starting? But it is. And so what was this kind of time off, do you think, used for? Because there's so much that has now changed for the Detroit Lions as they come into the 2025 season.
Yeah, there's a lot to assess. I'm not going to use the term rebuild because this team is so far from what we define a rebuild of being, but maybe retool would be appropriate word. I think when you look at John Morton coming in, Michigan native, now coming back in as offensive coordinator, that is really one of the biggest things I think we can analyze with the spring practices we did have, is that the offense, as Dan Campbell admitted, is maybe a couple steps behind where the defense was in the programming. So we'll have to see come next week, okay, are they in lockstep? Are they on the same page? Has there been improvement there? Or are we still going to see a slight difference in terms of Morton's application and his language, stuff like that? Otherwise, the biggest battle that was easy to drool over when it comes to spring practice was the inside OL. With Frank Ragnow's retirement, Tate Ratledge looks ready to step right up. He's got the fishing, he's got the body, he's got the mullet. The energy is there for sure, but he took the most reps at center. So that was by far my takeaway of the spring. And we just have to see, is that the same, or are we going to see a little Cupid shuffle over there?
Well, yeah, I'm sure the offensive line and obviously replacing a guy like Frank Ragnow is going to be a question until they get, the answer figure out one way or another. But obviously, the other big story, like you alluded to, is the shuffling of coordinators, the shuffling of assistant coaches that's happened. Ben Johnson obviously coming over to the Bears. We know the Lions and the Bears are kind of going to be connected because of that Ben Johnson connection for a while. But also Aaron Glenn leaving, the defensive coordinator as well. How worried are Lions fans? What's that level of, maybe concern amongst Detroit fans that maybe this could be a step back in a year that obviously is going to be very important with where the Lions are at in the division and still one of the favorites in the NFC?
I don't think we're at concern or worry levels yet. I think interest is fair, but I just think what we're working with right now is so little. Like I said, just spring practices, training camp, as if we all already don't have those couch quarterbacks assessing every single thing we're able to post from the field. It's just going to come down to, are they up to speed? Do they look week one ready? That hasn't been a problem the last few years when Campbell's managing the same group of people. But of course, Glenn's absence, Johnson's absence. I don't think there is anything to be worried about on the defensive side. And I'm not ready to say worried on the offensive side, but I think intrigued, maybe ear open to the ground in terms of, okay, is it going to catch up?
I think something Brad Holmes has done.
Part.
Oh, go ahead, Mike.
Sorry, Carm, you?
No, I just want to say that this roster, there's so many things about this roster and Brad Holmes doing so much to insulate against any sort of shuffling that did happen, where you look top to bottom, this is a really talented roster. And I think having a veteran quarterback in Jared Goff is really going to minimize maybe the impact that it otherwise would, changing out offensive coordinators. But Rachel, you mentioned it, John Morton's he's a familiar face. He's not a stranger to Detroit. You have Kelvin Shepherd being elevated on the defensive side. So how much do you think that continuity is really going to help in kind of making sure that the Lions don't take as much of a step back as maybe they would otherwise?
Glenn very specifically prepared Shep for this moment, whether it was coming this year or next year or farther down the line. He has been matriculated as Glenn's vision. He has been molded that way. Kelvin Shepherd is an incredible leader. Because he's not so far removed from his player's career, he does continue to have that relatability and understandability, and he uses that to his advantage when he's going to talk to the linebackers or this and that. He's also someone who played with Dan Campbell. When I sat down with him last year midseason to just talk about where he's at in his own coaching career, it's Dan Campbell that pulled him into this world. So the fact that he's also right alongside so many people in this building as being inspired by and almost in awe of Dan Campbell's energy to keep this ball moving, it just keeps everything on the right page and maybe bring some security to guys who might feel things could change this year, just given tools, injury returns, any number of things that affects a roster from year to year. But with Shep at that helm, I don't think anybody has a concern.
Well, obviously a lot of new with Detroit and the coaching staff, but then Ben Johnson coming over to the Bears. A lot of intrigue, obviously, around the league, how he's going to do in his first stint as the head man. Just with your time around Ben Johnson, how would you just describe his coaching style? And for maybe Bears fans that haven't seen him yet, obviously you're getting training camp going coming up, but how would you describe Ben Johnson to the people that don't know him yet in Chicago?
I gave this some thought this morning, and it's funny because I saw Odunze's comments about him being strict so far at practice, and that doesn't totally surprise me, but I didn't have to see that much of that side of him because here he wasn't in a position to have to enforce those things across 70 players. It doesn't shock me that he would be eager to keep everybody on the same page, set tight standards early, because this man is far from stupid. In fact, he is brilliant. I think he's a football genius. He is absolutely obsessed with consuming football at any level. And that's why his Rolodex of plays and tricks seems never ending. He constantly had people in the building here sending him notes, sending him things from college football clips. You name it. If there was a cool play that happened in football at any level in the United States, he was taking a look at it week in and week out. He's a true football guy. When it's about the game, Ben Johnson is locked in. It's almost slightly Joker style, not in a villain way, but like always calculating, always plotting. But he also told us last year that taking on the responsibilities of a head coach was something that really weighed on him. He asked if I am the type of man that has enough man to do that. Am I capable of that? So I do think outside of this fascinating and joyful football side of him, he also has a somewhat philosophical coaching side as well. So I'm not shocked that he's going into this wanting to set standards early. Nothing there has surprised me.
It's really interesting because just from what I've seen from him too, it's very detail oriented. He's been that way with the offense in Detroit since he took over, and now that's expanded to the rest of the team to kind of set that bar, set that standard. But something that we heard over and over again from Ben was that he was going to take his personnel into account when trying to devise this scheme, he warned this scheme was not going to look like the Detroit Lions offense. It was especially last year, because last year was the result of years and years kind of getting to be in Ben Johnson's system and evolving in that way. So how did you see the evolution happen in Detroit, and maybe how do you think that's going to translate then in Chicago? Are we going to see something completely new? How much new did you see over the last couple of years with Ben Johnson? It seems like he was just never his bag of tricks was never empty.
No, it really was never ending. And I also think that has to do with he was put in a position to succeed here. The way that not only Brad Holmes constructs this roster, but Dan Campbell can work with his coaching staff, and the way that Sheila Ford has, I'm not saying written a blank check, but given them authority to build the best system on and off the field means that everybody's allowed to work to their strengths in Allen Park. And knowing what Ben Johnson was capable of and letting him be the mega mind there meant taking other things off of his plate and allowing that to shine. But I also think in that experience, he learned, okay, a good head coach puts people in these right positions. And Dan might not be perfect at everything. He's going to let David Phipp go off about any special teams thing he wants. And he knows he wants a guy like that too. He knows I want to build my roster so that I don't need to be the expert at everything. I need to have experts in everything. I think that was a really important lesson he learned here. But also, that is what intrigues me about what comes next for him in this chapter is how do you learn to take a step back? We can all relate to that in our jobs, realizing what you are and aren't paid to do. And I think that's a really big distinction when coordinators become head coaches and is detrimental to them getting in their own way of success. If you can't say, okay, I cannot be watching this much film, I have to go focus on this or something else. That is of particular interest to me.
Yeah, and like you're talking about that delegation of responsibilities. Sometimes it is so hard to hand out, and maybe you feel so accountable that you want to kind of have your hands on everything. I feel like you hear first-time head coaches talk about that being one of the biggest challenges for them early on. So I'm curious how Ben Johnson's going to handle that too. But the one thing that, Bears fans and realistically anybody that wants to see the Bears have success, they want Ben Johnson to have his hands all over the development of Caleb Williams, right? That is going to be one of the biggest and most fundamental parts of success if Ben Johnson's going to have success with the Bears. How would you describe maybe the relationship that you saw between Ben Johnson and Jared Goff? And then obviously we're seeing Jared Goff featured a little bit in the Netflix special of quarterback as well. Was there anything maybe that kind of jumped out with that after seeing that a little bit come out this last week?
No, nothing in Netflix's drop has surprised me yet. But, it's fun. I love what Netflix does with these things because it does what we all want to do, is bring a little more humanity to these players and shows them a little bit of life outside of things. And honestly, I think we're all glad to see, like, oh my God, a cute dog. Oh my God. Like, these people are real. But when it comes to Ben Johnson and Jared Goff's relationship, it's different, and it's going to be different than what Caleb Williams is because, like you said, Caleb Williams is maybe in a little more developmental, moldable stage. Jared Goff certainly improved when he got traded to Detroit under Ben Johnson. There's a lot to say, but there's stages of development for these guys, right? I do think in football it's more condensed than we see with hockey or baseball or other sports going on in our two wonderful multi-sport cities. But Jared was in a later stage of that. He had a little more about him, knew what tools were there, and it was about changing the mental game for him as well as also exploiting his physical strengths. Caleb, I just feel like, is a much more blank slate. Of course, we know what he's talented at. He's not totally raw. However, I think Ben Johnson can direct him a little more, maybe is the better word, in terms of what he wants him to be instead of what he is. And I think that will be key. It seems like they're getting along well so far. I don't know that they're going to go golfing together, but that's not what this relationship has to be. It has to be respectful both ways, first and foremost.
It's interesting, too, because I think the biggest thing that Ben Johnson has said about his quarterbacks, and it was true with Jared Goff, is in the beginning, it was all about getting Jared to see the game as how Ben does, and for Ben to understand who Jared was as a player. And whether you're a developmental quarterback or not, I think that's going to be a constant for when he is, now that he's working with Caleb Williams. How did you see those interactions kind of develop over, you see them at practice. I know it's a limited window, but you see him at games. Is Ben Johnson the first one that Jared Goff would come over to on the sideline, for instance, after a play? Is it like when do they work off to the side together during practices? Is there maybe a little bit more attention paid to that position, given how it's important? I'm very curious to see kind of the rhythm and the cadence of how this relationship is going to develop, and if some of that's going to be, continuous from what he was doing with Jared Goff.
Yeah, that's a fair question. I think that also loops back into, responsibilities that a head coach may or may not give up. Obviously, looking at what Ben is walking into in Chicago, he's probably going to remain play calling. But that was one of his jobs here. And that also interrupts a sideline rhythm. That doesn't mean you have all the time in the world to go sit on the iPad and break this down while the defense is on the field. However, there were frequent discussions, especially when it would come to praise or affirmation on the sidelines. You see a little bit of that in Netflix if you really want a closer view than sometimes we have in the press box or when I'm running down the other sideline. But that, I think, was important. It's less about in-game adjustments on the sideline and more about, hey, quick this, very short and sweet, but affirmations. Halftime, Ben Johnson is an adjustment wizard. We saw that plenty of times with this Lions offense. Even though they were able to keep everybody under their boot for quite a while this season, they were also really adept at making those halftime adjustments. Going into the locker room, nobody's chilling in there. Dan Skipper isn't even vomiting in there yet. What they're doing is adjusting. They're not ever content with just saying, okay, we're going to run back what we just did. So I think that's one of his strengths and where he's really going to give feedback as well. Practice, they're definitely in sync. He's quick to be out there, not always on an iPad, but walking, conversing, looking at the live reps, stuff like that. But again, when you think about the quarterback structure here, Jared was miles above the guys behind him. Even when Teddy Bridgewater came in, that man doesn't need that much oversight. So there's a difference between Ben catching up with Jared. How are you feeling about this? How's your thumb? Versus, okay, here are our backups. here's what we're working with, they're raw. He would more often than not hand that off to the rest of his quarterback staff than Ben Johnson getting in those guys' ear.
You look ahead to week 2, Ben Johnson is going to be returning to Detroit with the Bears team that is going to have a lot of questions themselves that they need to answer. And, a pretty big early season game for the Bears position, I would say, but maybe the Lions as well, too, with all the changes that we talked about. I'm sure it's going to be important for the Lions to start strong as well. How do you think that game is going to be, and what's the reception going to be like for Ben Johnson returning to Detroit?
It could be a trap game, if I'm allowed to say that, like months out from this, just for either of them. These teams are reshaping new identities. Like I said, retooling, I think, is the most appropriate word here. And depending on how week 1 goes, their confidence could be high, could be low. They're not going to say it gets that high or that low. But being that early on in the season, you only have so much to work with. When Ben Johnson walks into Ford Field, I expect boos. Fans did not like how he left, even if they loved what he did for them the last few years. What came out regarding the interview timeline and the process, some of those are inevitable and not his fault. Some of those are choices, and you have to live with those choices of deciding, hey, I do want to take this interview, or can I do this after the run? I don't think anything he did was wrong, but that's going to, regarding your reputation, being interpreted differently, especially when that type of information comes out, that fans will find a correlation between you losing to the Commanders and you taking an early interview. I don't think that's right, but regardless, the facts are the facts, and the timeline is all these fans have to work with, and it's all we have to work with right now. So that being said, I don't expect a warm welcome back for him, which, just as someone who loves sports, it can be disappointing. Like, this man took you to new heights, truly new heights, and that's a bummer that he doesn't get to be celebrated here for that. But I think he's someone who knows how good of a job he did. That's why he got a new job with a lot more money. So it's a consequence of your actions. Maybe he will embody a Joker moment there. Maybe I foreshadowed it.
Well, he's dove right into the rivalry in his introductory press conference in Chicago. He calls out Matt LaFleur. Something about this division just in general, though, and you alluded to it by saying, listen, he's probably going to get food. This division, the rivalries are so strong because it's such a traditional and kind of older division. Some of the original teams are part of this division, and so they've had a long time to play against each other, and it's something I appreciate so much. But it's also now looking like one of the toughest, if not the toughest divisions in football, not only last year, but this coming year as well. So how does that affect the Lions? I am kind of the volition, like, it's not going to take 15 wins to win this division again, because the wins have to come from somewhere. And if you're saying all these other teams are good and they're improved, like the Bears, they're going to have more in the win column, where do those wins come from? Do you think the Lions, this is still their division to lose?
That's a great question. And I think that also revolves around, can the Vikings run it back? Was last year just a fluke? Do they have the capacity to maintain their standard as well? Do we have another battle of 15 teams where we're all crying about the rule book? Like, I don't know. And when we talk about the division, they might be the biggest question mark to me above everything else. The more I think about this era of the NFC North, I have to hearken it back to the AFC East that I grew up with. The Packers used to be this stable team, Aaron Rodgers, just as Brady was for the Patriots. And when you look at what the Bears have been, I can't help but think they feel like how people I grew up with talked about the Jets. Like, it's all I can think of is they're in their own turmoil and their own chaos and their quarterback woes and some curses and some trauma. And then we get to today. And who are the Lions? They're in this rapid fire, unprecedented shot up to success. Can they hold on to that crown? I want to say yes, with Aiden Hutchinson coming back, with different ideas at the table. I worried that even if Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn did together run it back this year, that maybe people would be on to their gig. You can be the smartest person in the world, but people learn from tape. And I worried that maybe they would be their own demise. Maybe the secret this year is to retooling. But I do agree with you that I don't think the parity is going to get in their way at all this year. Maybe we compare it to our baseball teams as well. I'm not going to say it's that far of a gap with the Tigers and the rest of the crowd for the Lions, but I could see them padding some significant wins early.
Well, yeah, it could be a fun October in Detroit for you guys out there. I mean, you got a great baseball team. It looks like you're going to have fun with the Lions as well this year. But like as you're alluding to, a lot of that success, especially in this division, seems like it's going to come from these quarterbacks. And there's a couple question marks in the quarterback rooms for all the teams. I think when you look at Green Bay, Jordan Love has shown success, but maybe there's question marks there. Jared Love. I'm sorry, Jared Goff obviously has been a great performer in this league, but he still kind of has that stigma around the league of maybe not being a top tier quarterback. And then obviously you have the two younger guys with JJ McCarthy and Caleb Williams. How would you rank these four quarterbacks going into the year? Obviously, there's a lot of different ways that you could look at it, but just quarterback, maybe the most confidence that you have, and is Jared Goff at the top of that list?
My cat just jumped off the table because she doesn't want to answer that question, so I'll have to handle it. It's so interesting when I hear people, talk about Jared Goff being not a top-tier quarterback. I totally understand that perception going into last year. I think we could all agree, as talented as he was limited in enough areas that he was not widely considered on that elite level. I'm not one to sit here and say that's right or wrong at this time, but we could all agree the general consensus was stacking things up. But last year, his accuracy was so historic and insane and key to Ben Johnson being able to keep this thing running that, to me, I don't think that's an argument anymore. So given what else is going on, it's hard not to put him very clearly at the top of this division when it comes to those under center. After that, I'm tempted to just say Jordan Love because we have the most on him when it comes to Caleb and JJ. I think JJ is a great raw talent from what we saw here at Michigan, and I look forward to what him and Kevin McCarthy can do. I think that's an incredible pairing to see. However, we just don't have enough for me to be able to assess them equally. Yes, you're an NFL quarterback. That only gets you so far when you're comparing this much experience. So to me, it's very clear Jared and then Jordan just based off of that alone. Maybe Caleb ends up becoming a more finesse talent than Jordan, and good for him to be able to say that. But right now, I have absolutely no confidence in that today. Then how are you really supposed to differentiate between JJ and Caleb at this point? Based off of tape from years ago, based off of limited practices, I don't know. I think they're different personalities. They're in different systems. They both have weapons at their disposal. But to me, the differentiation is, what do you do under pressure? Like a 2-minute drill, clock's winding down. It's the fourth quarter. You're down by 3. What can you get your team into confidently? Are you only able to get a field goal, or are you locking in a red zone drive? And that, to me, as soon as we see that from either of those, that's where I'll be able to tell you the difference.
Okay, got to remember
and I think
to use
if you're
those
Caleb
timeouts
Williams
as well, too. When you drive them down, you got to use those timeouts correctly, too, as we saw. But that's part of the learning curve as well. So we know that. But it will be
Game
interesting with the
management,
quarterbacks.
hopefully Ben Johnson brings a little better to the table.
I think that if you're Caleb Williams, too, you don't want anybody to, you don't want your reputation to be staked on last year. And of the turmoil that was happening in Chicago. And so, it's a clean slate for both of those guys. And how are you supposed to evaluate that at this point? But Rachel, thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with us, for coming in and giving us the last team in our rivalry recon series. We learned, I'm so excited to see what the Lions are going to look like this year. Like you said, there's so many different question marks across the division and how it's going to shake out. I keep getting asked, how do you rank this division? I have no idea. I really don't, because anything at this point could happen. So thanks for giving us a little bit more insight. If you guys want to catch Rachel, she covers the Lions and all Detroit sports for CBS Detroit and does a phenomenal job up there. So thank you again, Rachel, for joining us on our Rivalry Recon series.
Thank you, guys. This only gets me more excited for my next trip back to Soldier Field. I love being in Chicago. I love these great sports cities, and I feel like we're so lucky to not only be within proximity, but like you alluded to earlier, Carmen, just have these historic rivalries that makes every matchup matter between us.
Thanks, Rachel. Hopefully we'll see a little Cubs Tigers in October, too. Let's see it. That'd be awesome.
Sure.
We have a special treat today because we had one guest, not just one guest, we have 2 guests today. And now we get to welcome in NFL Network's Stacey Dales, who is a fixture in the NFC North, covers these teams so incredibly well. We were talking off camera, Stace, and it sounds like you're going to be doing a whole training camp tour, not only of the division, but some other teams. How's your summer going?
Yeah, hey guys, Carmen and Mike. My summer's going well, but as we kind of talked about here during the break, it's disintegrating, if you will, not just because of the Chicago humidity, but because training camp, it feels like we're about to like bang on the door. I will be hitting a plethora of teams, starting with the Bears. I go right to the Packers, and then I head to the Lions. I will get to the Vikings, I'm sure, at some point, but it's going to be a fun way to start our back together weekend.
I'm so excited to have you on to talk about kind of this division as a whole because of the fact that last year, I think it was the toughest division in football, and I think that's probably going to be the case again this year. I don't know if I'm sure you get asked. I get asked all the time, how do you rank these teams? What do you expect? Is this the Lions division to lose? Are the Bears still bringing up the rear? And the answer is I don't know. So what are your expectations for this division?
Yeah.
So I can just use your answer every time going forward.
Oh my gosh. Well, you can't really put anybody on the spot with this division. I think you guys know that after we saw three of the teams head to the playoffs a season ago. The Lions, obviously, with the 15 wins, the Vikings with 14, and the Packers is sneaking in there with 11. And then you had the Bears with, at 5-12 with a rookie quarterback in Caleb Williams and a lot of drama ensuing in Chicago. It is, I liken it to if you've ever kind of watched a marathon or you have done a marathon and competed in a marathon, you might try to pace yourself with certain teams, but there's always that little group at the pack that is up there. And that's how I see the NFC North. They're kind of trying to stay in this race together, neck and neck, a little bit of an arms race, if you will. And, there's some really interesting storylines because I really think divisionally, you guys, the schedule is just grueling when you think about where these teams are going. You've got the AFC North in the mix that they're going to have to compete against. The NFC East is going to be better. So the schedule certainly isn't easy. And you start there with Detroit. Until somebody knocks off the Detroit Lions, my friends, they're the ones that are going to be chased. But like I said, it seems to be that everybody's better on paper and healthy, at least at this stage, heading into training camp.
Yeah, and that's what's going to make it a fun year, especially when you have a competitive division like this. It should only make each team in the division better, right? And we've seen that with other strong divisions in the past around the NFL. I'm curious now going into this, obviously from the Bears' perspective, you talk about the tough schedule, you talk about tough division. We know that Bears fans are not going to be patient with the development of Caleb Williams and the pairing of Ben Johnson. That's just kind of life in the NFL. Chicago fans are very much like that, but that's anywhere in the NFL. With that in mind, knowing it could be maybe a tough start, what do you want to see from Caleb Williams and Ben Johnson together to maybe show that progress is being made, even if it's not early, but maybe throughout the course of the season?
Well, I think this is an interesting conversation, Mike, because when you talk about being patient or rather impatient, Bears fans always are. And there have been these constant regime changes, right? Every few years, there's a new cycle of coaches. I really feel like the difference that Ben Johnson brings is he was the most coveted coaching prospect amongst all and has been really for the past couple of cycles. And it's because of what we saw him do and orchestrate offensively with the Detroit Lions. I mean, just a season ago, right, as their offensive play caller, over 400 yards in terms of total yards per game. They averaged 32 points per game. I mean, they were the most feared offense, you can argue, in the National Football League. And I think what was interesting about his offenses is they ran the ball equally adeptly to throwing the football. And, you can certainly schematically get into some of the different things that Ben Johnson loves to do with his offensive line, for instance. But the fact that he had this ability to progressively not only become married and linked at the hip to Jared Goff, his quarterback, but score and find ways to use his personnel at really a unique level each season tells me that in Chicago, and this is really true, and I know you guys probably would agree with this, I really believe Ben Johnson is a play caller that looks at his personnel and says, what does this group of personnel, in fact, that's the question that I most want to ask him. What do your players in Chicago do well? What does Caleb do well that Jared maybe didn't do that you're going to exploit? And I think with all these play callers and their quarterbacks, it's all about details, fundamentals, and a trust factor. And they have been joined at the hip this offseason. And so I really feel like just that alone and the details with which Ben Johnson goes about things, starting with his quarterback, is going to see instant progress, but points have to be put up there on the board.
You've sat down with both of these guys, in Ben Johnson and Caleb Williams, at various points this offseason. How have you kind of seen that relationship start to develop? Because it's a process. It was a process when Ben Johnson took over as offensive coordinator for Jared Goff. It's a process now that he's been tasked with developing and building Caleb Williams back from the ground up. Caleb said he wants to be coached hard. He's getting his wish. Is that a good thing? Are they starting to kind of mesh, at least from what you've heard from them?
Carmen, I think that we're going to learn a lot in training camp with these guys, but the initial things that Ben Johnson told us were very straightforward. I have to be able to see the game through the lens of the quarterback, and he has to be able to see the game through the lens of the play caller. Now, what I really think Caleb Williams is going to benefit from with Ben Johnson is one thing I don't think that gets talked about enough with him as a play caller in the NFL, is his ability in game to diagnose coverage for his quarterback. Now, when you have a Jared Goff who is able to see the game at a different level and really competed at an MVP caliber level last season in Detroit specifically, that helps. But, when you think about progression offenses, that we all talk about, pure progression offenses, he's got his first read, his second read, his third read, now he's got to get to the other side of the field. Well, what happened to Caleb Williams last year, right? He was sacked more than any other quarterback in the league. He did hold the ball too long, which is something they're going to clean up, and they've been working on cleaning up. But Ben Johnson's ability to understand those coverage looks, go back and watch the tape, for instance, of their games against the Vikings just last season. And the waves of, the bevy of different looks that Brian Flores gives anybody, but tried to give the Detroit Lions, and the adjustments that Ben Johnson made throughout the course of those games. He does it as well as any play caller, and I think that's really going to help his young quarterback. The other thing, guys, I would just add is the brains of the offense has to be the offensive line. And because the Bears strategically retooled that group, it's going to really help the young quarterback in his second season.
Yeah, Stacey, I was going to ask you about that impact of the offensive line and how that can change this offense, not only just for the play caller, for the quarterback, but also the running game. It seems that obviously that was going to be a huge, influence and, a big priority for them in the offseason, and then they came out and did it. Are you impressed? And how would you say, the Bears did in the offseason addressing that problem, which was a huge one last year?
Yeah, I'm impressed on paper for sure, and some of the resume that comes with it, right? We know about Joe Thuney, Drew Dolman, Jonah Jackson, and those guys are going to start on that interior, and we'll see about how Braxton Jones comes back on the bookend. But yeah, for now, I'm really pleased with it because I think Thuney's going to tune everybody up, if you will, with this offensive line. He's a 4-time Super Bowl champion. But when you think about offensive line play and what you're asking those guys to do, I mean, whether it's a power run game or you're running an outside stretch zone scheme, Ben Johnson always finds a way, incorporating his tight ends in there as well, to really max protect when he needs to and to really run the football when he needs to. And I think that's going to be the most interesting thing. I think the biggest X factor for me with these Bears is how this backfield really comes together, starting with DeAndre Swift. I've heard really good things about their rookie, Kyle Monangai, and the impact he can have in the power run game. But Ben Johnson loves to run the football. Does he have the personnel that he believes he's going to be able to do that with? Because they ran it third most in the NFL last season, you guys. They had 29 rushing touchdowns, I believe. It helps when you have Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. But listen, that'll be very interesting to see how balanced they can be offensively, which I really would think would help Caleb Williams.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes a Ben Johnson offense so incredibly potent is that it is so balanced, and you really never know. You can't
Mm-hmm.
pin your ears back as a defender and count on them passing the ball 50 times a game. That's not something that Ben Johnson's ever going to do. But that offensive line, I'm so glad that you brought it up, Stacey, because that's the one thing that is going to make things easier. So that even if they didn't add a ton to the backfield, a seventh round pick is not nothing. But if they didn't add a ton to the offensive backfield, you have to think that some of those rushing lanes are going to open a little bit easier now that you have those five guys. But when do you expect that to kind of happen? Should we be preaching a little bit of patience here? Because listen, as good as those
Yes.
five guys look individually on paper, they've never played together. This whole system is new. What is the runway? What is the learning curve that we should expect from these Chicago Bears to start the season?
It takes a while. I would just send everybody back to the Philadelphia Eagles last season when they lost Jason Kelsey, and Cam Jurgens was asked to step in his second season, I believe, and become the center of the what would become Super Bowl champion Philadelphia Eagles. That first wave of games took a little bit for the quarterback Jalen Hurts and his new center to figure it out. And I think anytime you have a change in a different piece to your offensive line, that's going to be the case. So they're always going to tell you guys the hyperbole, like we got to put the pads on. Well, I'm just happy the Bears don't have a competition at center this season, because that really bothered me last offseason in training camp, because to me, the center is the most important guy on the offensive line in terms of making sure the operation runs right with his quarterback. I see you saying thank you. And I'm really excited overall for Bears fans about their new staff. There's a lot of former players that are coaches. I like the defensive coordinator. There's just a lot to like right now. And certainly, though, got to get the pads on and then get ready for this, week 1 Minnesota Vikings. And we'll get the preseason too a little bit.
Well, we're getting there very quickly. And NFL Network senior national reporter Stacey Dale joining us here on the Chicago Football Show. Stacey, thanks again so much for joining us. Before I let you go, though, I have to ask, for all of us that are either watching on Marquee Sports Network or checking us out on YouTube, they could see your dog, maybe the most chill dog in the background. I just got asked, he looks like he is having such a great time, maybe enjoying his summer before training camp ends up. What's your dog's name? He looks so cute. She looks so
cute. Do you guys see her? I mean, do you really see her?
Yeah.
She's just now.
She's enjoying herself.
Okay, so this conversation really took her to another level, you guys. That's Blue, and she's my magnet. But yeah, that's baby Blue right there, and she just loves football so much that it soothes her and puts her to sleep. This is where I spend, this little dungeon-esque room right here is where I spend most of my time, whether I'm like looking at, tape or talking to somebody about football or doing one of these. And Blue is always right there over my left shoulder. So thanks for seeing her, Mike.
Well, we love that Blue joined us as well, Stacey. Thank you so much again for joining us. That's going to be a bunch of football fans in about 8 to 9 weeks here, about 4 o'clock. Get that midday nap, watching the early games, and we get into that rhythm of football. And we're so excited for that to be happening again. So thanks again, Stacey, for joining us here on the Chicago Football Show.
Thanks for having me, guys.